case, many of these protesters were actually in the street blocking, or at the very least confronting, vehicles that were either coming out or into that federal facility. And you see sort of the law enforcement officers strategizing. They do seem to be going back at this point. Not sure the exact strategy, but you see them now retreating back. A big law enforcement presence. But again, as they swelled quickly, they seem to be shrinking back, but a show of force, no doubt, that these protesters do not seem to be intimidated for whatever reason. They are still yelling. They've gotten even.
This situation is already past the point of control. What you're watching is not protest management. It's a containment failure. Federal vehicles are moving under pressure. Law enforcement is retreating in real time. Crowds surge forward the moment authority pulls back. This isn't hypothetical, this is happening now, and the consequences are already unfolding before the legal system has even had a chance to catch up. Picture the scene clearly: a federal facility, vehicles attempting to enter and exit, protesters not standing on sidewalks, not holding signs behind barricades, but physically in the street, confronting movement, forcing hesitation, forcing retreat. Watch the officers cluster, watch the repositioning, watch the calculation happening live, then watch the reversal. The line pulls back, the presence shrinks, the crowd grows louder, louder because the message is received instantly. Pressure works. That moment matters. Because once authority retreats under confrontation, the entire structure changes. This stops being about crowd control and becomes about precedent. It becomes about who governs space, who controls movement, who enforces law, and who decides when law pauses. And right now, the answer is dangerously unclear. The shock isn't just the protest, the shock is the pattern. This wasn't a one-off surge. This wasn't spontaneous chaos. This has been building across days, across locations, across jurisdictions. Vehicles blocked, agents surrounded. Law enforcement appears suddenly, disappears suddenly. A show of force that doesn't hold. A presence that swells, then collapses. Each time reinforcing the same lesson: escalation gets results. And that lesson doesn't stay contained. It travels, it spreads. Minneapolis first, then downtown, then the federal buildings, then hotels believed to house agents, then Washington, D.C. and nationwide. Hundreds of protests, thousands of participants, coordinated timing, shared messaging, shared targets. This isn't noise. This is structure forming in real time. The stakes are no longer limited to public safety in one city. This has crossed into federal authority, congressional oversight, and institutional legitimacy. Because once federal facilities become pressure points instead of secured spaces, everything downstream is affected. Immigration enforcement, detention operations, agent safety, oversight access, judicial review, political accountability. And hovering over all of this is the triggering event: the fatal shooting of Renee Good by an ICE agent. That incident is the ignition source. But what you're seeing now is not just grief. It's not just outrage. It's leverage. It's a calculated confrontation with federal power, testing how far resistance can go before consequences actually arrive. And here's where it tightens. Local leadership is already issuing warnings, peaceful protest encouraged, property damage condemned, arrests promised, accountability emphasized, but those statements exist in tension with what's visible on the ground. Because when officers retreat and crowds advance, when unlawful assemblies are declared only after hours of marching, when arrests happen late and selectively, authority starts to look reactive, not decisive. This is where the narrative shifts. This is no longer about whether protests are justified. This is about whether the rule of law is operational in moments of political stress. And once that question enters the picture, everything escalates. Courts get involved, Congress gets involved, federal agencies get scrutinized, and the margin for error collapses. This is the opening phase of a much larger confrontation. And it doesn't end with chants or barricades. It ends in filings, hearings, rulings, and consequences that don't care how loud the streets were. This situation is already past the point of control. What you're watching is not protest management. It's a containment failure. Federal vehicles are moving under pressure. Law enforcement is retreating in real time. Crowds surge forward the moment authority pulls back. This isn't hypothetical. This is happening now, and the consequences are already unfolding before the legal system has even had a chance to catch up. Let's reset the trust baseline briefly, because this audience already understands the difference between protest rights and operational authority. The First Amendment protects assembly. It does not suspend federal jurisdiction. It does not grant physical control over secured facilities. And it does not override enforcement obligations triggered by federal statute. That distinction is the fault line running through everything you're seeing. Federal Protective Service and ICE operations fall under explicit statutory mandates. Access control to federal buildings is not discretionary optics management. It is a legal requirement. When vehicles enter or exit those facilities, they are not engaging in optional movement. They are executing federal functions. Blocking that movement isn't symbolic. It's an interference with federal operations. Now add the presence of members of Congress attempting an oversight visit. Oversight is constitutionally grounded. Agencies are required to permit access subject to security constraints. What we saw instead was limited entry, brief observation, and an enforced exit. 20 detainees observed, oversight claimed, oversight contested. That alone triggers a separate legal pathway, because once lawmakers assert obstruction of oversight, this stops being an enforcement optics issue and becomes an interbranch conflict. Congress doesn't negotiate oversight access through protest dynamics. It resolves it through subpoenas, hearings, and budgetary pressure. And those mechanisms are slow, deliberate, and punishing. Layer on top of that the arrests, unlawful assembly declarations, multiple warnings issued, 29 arrests made. Not indiscriminate, but targeted. That matters, because selective enforcement during mass protest environments becomes evidence in later challenges. Defense attorneys argue uneven application, prosecutors argue for restraint, judges evaluate consistency, and courts don't rule on vibes, they rule on records. Now expand the scope. Similar protest strategies appear across cities. Hotels targeted. Agent housing is suspected. Marches allowed to swell without visible law enforcement, then confronted all at once. That tactic is deliberate. It's meant to minimize immediate friction while preserving arrest authority later. But it also creates perception gaps, and perception gaps invite escalation. This is where legal exposure multiplies. Municipal liability enters. Federal liability enters. Coordination failures become discoverable. Body camera footage becomes evidence. Communication logs become exhibits. And suddenly, what felt like crowd management becomes a stack of documents moving toward a courtroom. Meanwhile, federal agencies face parallel pressure. ICE enforcement policies are already under litigation. Use of force incidents trigger internal review, external review, civil suits, consent decree arguments. And when protests directly reference a pattern of unchecked violence, they are laying groundwork, not chanting slogans. That language matters. Pattern claims invite statistical analysis, comparative enforcement data, prior incidents, policy memos, training materials. Courts take those seriously. Legislators take them even more seriously. And then there's the executive layer. The White House becomes a protest site. Messaging escalates. Calls for leadership removal, demands for reform, accusations of lawlessness. Once protests reach the executive doorstep, institutional response shifts from local containment to national coordination. At this stage, there is no clean exit. Every response option creates additional exposure. Aggressive enforcement risks civil liability. Passive retreat risks institutional erosion. Delayed action risks judicial rebuke. And political silence creates its own vacuum. This is the legal gravity beneath the street-level visuals, and gravity always wins. Now watch how the image collapses under pressure. The official messaging emphasizes restraint, professionalism, and peace. The visuals show swelling crowds, blocked movement, retreating lines, and anger intensifying the moment authority pulls back. That contradiction doesn't resolve itself. It widens. Protesters read it instantly. They see the pattern. Law enforcement appears, protesters surge. Law enforcement retreats, protesters occupy. Vehicles attempt movement, crowds converge. That cycle reinforces itself because it keeps producing the same result. Access delayed, pressure rewarded, and once that cycle locks in, escalation becomes automatic. Federal agents become symbols, not individuals. Facilities become targets, not buildings. Oversight visits become flashpoints. Arrests become proof points. Every interaction becomes content. Every response is recorded, replayed, analyzed, and amplified. At the same time, institutional patience thins. Judges don't tolerate repeated interference with federal operations. Prosecutors don't ignore sustained obstruction. Congressional committees don't drop oversight disputes quietly. Each system has its own escalation ladder, and all of them are now engaged. This is where options start disappearing. Crack down hard and you invite injunctions, civil suits, and national backlash. Hold back and you signal loss of control. Attempt a compromise and you fracture authority. Delay decisions and you create evidence of indecision. And the crowd doesn't need to win outright. It only needs to keep pressure constant. Because institutions exhaust themselves trying to balance optics while preserving control. You can already see the strain. Local officials warn against chaos while condemning federal chaos. Federal agencies maintain a presence while retreating tactically. Politicians call for peace while promising arrests. Every message contradicts another. And in that contradiction, credibility erodes. This is where humiliation enters. Not theatrical humiliation, but institutional exposure. The image of seamless authority collapses when enforcement becomes reactive. When decisions appear improvised, when control is asserted verbally, but withdrawn physically. history is full of these moments, not because protests always win, but because institutions that hesitate invite deeper challenges, and deeper challenges force harder responses later. That's the trap. At this stage, every available option is bad, and that's not opinion, that's structural reality. Option 1, assert dominance. Clear streets aggressively, secure perimeters fully, make arrests early and broadly. That restores control temporarily, but triggers immediate legal challenges. Civil rights suits, emergency injunctions, federal oversight hearings. The courts step in fast. Option 2, continue restrained engagement. Allow protests to swell, pull back when tensions rise, arrest selectively. That preserves optics but corrodes authority. It trains future crowds to escalate, it normalizes interference, and it emboldens national replication. Option 3, political intervention, executive statements, agency reviews, promised reforms. That defers confrontation but concedes legitimacy to the pressure. And once concessions begin under street-level force, they don't stop cleanly. None of these options restores equilibrium. They all move the system toward adjudication. And that's where the rule of law reasserts itself. Not emotionally, procedurally. Courts don't negotiate, they issue orders. Judges don't chant, they compel compliance. Congressional committees don't shout, they subpoena. The rule of law doesn't care about volume, it cares about jurisdiction, authority, statute, record. What's unfolding now is the messy middle before that snapback occurs, the chaos phase before structure reasserts itself, the noise before consequences arrive, and when they arrive unevenly, not on crowds, on agencies, on leaders, on policies, on budgets, on careers. The political fallout is already forming. Lawmakers are staking positions. Advocacy groups are coordinating nationally. Federal agencies are preparing internal defenses. Legal teams are assembling timelines. And the courts are watching quietly. This doesn't end with a weekend of action. It ends with filings, with hearings, with rulings that narrow discretion and harden boundaries. Because every time federal authority retreats under pressure, the system compensates later with rigidity. That's the pattern. Flexibility first, enforcement later, always later. The rule of law doesn't collapse in moments like this. It tightens. It responds slowly, deliberately, and without regard for slogans. And when it moves through institutions that don't reverse easily. What you're watching now is the last phase before that inevitability sets in. The loud phase, the chaotic phase, the moment when it feels like pressure is winning. It never lasts. The courts will decide access, Congress will decide oversight, agencies will adjust policy, and the consequences will land where they always do, on power structures, not crowds. That outcome isn't speculation, it's structural, and it's coming.